Chapter 4. But of course, not until weeks afterwards did I know that my warning had been disregarded. For some time after my scoop, I was the happiest man at German headquarters. I thought that I had done a really big job. I walked about Charleville as if I owned the place, for by this time I was so self-confident that I had no fears whatsoever. Definitely now I was no longer Captain Bernard Newman, but Captain Adolphe Newman. I had good reason to be confident. I was getting on very well in my job, and it was obvious that my superior officers thought well of me. For weeks I did not experience a single moment's anxiety. Judge then of my consternation when, on returning late one evening from a visit to one of the armies in the field, on arrival at my billet, my batman informed me that my father was waiting to see me. It was, as may well be imagined, a hectic moment. This was one of the things I had certainly never expected. Adolphe's father was a major who had been retired years before the war, but had been called up to command a Landwehr battalion, which had been engaged on the Russian front. What on earth was he doing here? Was there anything wrong? But of course I had to pull myself together immediately, and to walk into my room with every show of surprise and affection. Yet could a father be deceived in his own son? Apparently he could. At any rate, Adolphe's father greeted me as Adolphe, and why should he not? He had already been speaking to some of my friends. Remember, too, that there was absolutely nothing which might lead him to suspect that things were otherwise than they appeared to be. So feeling myself very quickly on firm ground again, I turned the conversation from myself and asked why he was here. His explanation was a perfectly simple one. His brigade had been withdrawn from Russia to serve on the Belgian frontier, for the troops who acted as guards were having the greatest difficulty in preventing communication across the frontier, and reinforcements were urgently necessary. As the men in my father's brigade were all comparatively elderly, for soldiers at any rate, nearly all being on the wrong side of 50, they had been withdrawn from the minor actions of the Russian front for this purpose. My father chuckled with delight at the thought that now he would only be some 20 or 30 miles from me, for his headquarters were to be somewhere in the region of Louvain. Maybe I was not quite so excited at the thought, but at least I did not show it. After we had talked for some time, I asked him to excuse me for a few minutes, as I had to make my report to Colonel Nicolai. He asked if he could come with me, for he had known Colonel Nicolai in his own soldier days. The colonel greeted him most warmly, was good enough to say nice things about me, and even threw out a hint that I might be appointed very shortly to more important service. This pleased both me and my father, for vastly different reasons. It helped me considerably in another detail too. My father had mentioned how much my mother wanted to see me. I will drop the quotes and consider Adolphe's parents as mine. He was sure that I should be getting leave soon, but I was now able to point out, quite naturally, that if I was to be put onto an important job, I might still have to wait a long time before I was able to go home. My father, to whom military duty came first, second, and third, agreed without question. He himself, as soon as he had settled down his battalion in its new post, would be proceeding on leave. At least, he said, he would be able to tell my mother and sister that I was well and doing well too. A week later, my chief gave me details of my new job. He had always treated me in a most kindly fashion. There was nothing of the pre-war picture of the Prussian militarist about Colonel Nicolai. I sat at ease, smoking one of his excellent cigars, while he gave me a little lecture on the German intelligence work, a lecture which was fascinating in its interest. He explained to me how the greater part of the German agents operating in England prior to the war had been arrested immediately on its commencement. Incidentally, I found out that their numbers were comparatively small, perhaps 1,000th part of the quantity existing in the minds of nervous old ladies and imaginative journalists. It had thus been necessary for Germany to build up a new system. On the naval side, it was working fairly well. Several agents had been discovered and shot, however notable among them being Karl Lottie, who died a hero's death in the Tower of London. But so far as the military side was concerned, the intelligence service in England was very nearly non-existent. To date, that had not been particularly serious, for the British Army was so comparatively small that its operations could not seriously inconvenience the German command. Incidentally, I should point out that the German intelligence service differed entirely in its direction from ours. We had a national service controlled by the War Office. In Germany, the service was controlled by the Chief Intelligence Officer at General Headquarters, and the German War Office had comparatively little control over it. There were advantages and disadvantages in both systems. To come to the point, Colonel Nicolai said that he had decided to engage neutral agents to go into England to gather information. He didn't like the idea, as he always proclaimed spying is a gentleman's job, but there were so few German officers who were capable of undertaking such work. Unfortunately, a German, even if he does not look like a German, invariably talks like a German as soon as he tackles a foreign language. Even today, I suppose the number of Germans who can speak English without any trace of accent is remarkably small. But neutrals, of course, were in a different category. They could go over to England, providing their own national passport was in order without hindrance. The great difficulty so far had been to discover men of sufficient ability and intelligence who were willing to undertake the job. This work was what he wanted me to do, to go to Holland, select a dozen or even 20 men and offer them a suitable payment if they would go to England and find out the things we wanted to know. He gave me a rough sketch of our principal requirements. They related to the new armies which England was then raising, and also the position as regards manpower, which was engaging the most serious attention of the government. It was already known that the Allies were planning a tremendous offensive against Germany during the summer as a result of the forthcoming operations against Verdun. It was doubtful whether the French would be able to sustain their share of the attack, which the British would have to deliver alone. We must have details, particularly how many new divisions were to be sent to France. The men I selected must, of course, be able to speak English fluently. They must be prepared to take a risk, although an intelligent man might be able to pick up a good deal of useful information by hanging about the military camps, or perhaps I should say, hanging about the hostelries about the camps. Doubtless, one such report would not be of any use, but a large number suitably collated would yield a lot of information to a discerning examining officer. That then was my commission. My chief could see that I was pleased with the job, but he did not know the reason for my satisfaction. Had he tried, he could not have played better into my hands. True, I would be leaving German headquarters for a while, but I could at least make sure that my report about Verdun had received proper treatment, and could take the opportunity of being in a neutral country to send a whole shoal of invaluable information home, including extremely useful details about the German intelligence service in France. Even at this stage, however, I had just sufficient foresight to get in an excuse which might be very necessary. I pointed out that neutrals who do intelligence work purely for the money are not very dependable persons. Colonel Nikolai appreciated my comment. It was his own opinion. He agreed that it was a stiff task that he was asking of me. He knew how intensely difficult it would be to find the right people, and to keep them up to scratch. He would give me all the necessary credit if I succeeded, but would not blame me unduly if I failed. This was the sort of assurance that I wanted, and a few days later, when my immediate chief had gone into great detail with me, I crossed the frontier into Holland with a light heart, and with civilian clothes. I was now liable myself to arrest a spy, though not, of course, to condemnation to death, for espionage in most countries, even when not directed against the country, is a punishable offense. But what was such a risk after those which I had run? Besides, everything was perfectly prepared for me. I was a junior partner of the firm of Dirks & Co., which had its headquarters in Rotterdam. Thither I hastened, and was duly received by the managing director. I was allocated a private room, a secretary who was a German girl, and an almost unlimited banking account. Thus I began my job. I did it very well, too. In all, from the numerous applicants who answered the vague inquiries with which I spread out in all directions, I selected 16 men. I trained them in a little school. I trained them so well that out of the 16, no fewer than 13 were arrested in England. Of these, 12 were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. The 3 who escaped did so with official connivance, for obviously it would not do for the whole lot to be roped in, but the information they brought, although it appeared to be a lot, actually amounted to no more than newspaper gossip. When I reviewed the position, however, it seemed to me that I had been a little too drastic and wholesale. In spite of my chief's assurances, an officer who returned with so complete a story of failure would not be likely to be given a big job again, so I decided that I must do something desperate to justify my appointment. Spying is a gentleman's job. I remembered my chief's pet phrase. Accordingly, I sent a note to Colonel Nikolai, telling him that I was so disappointed at the efforts of the neutrals that I had decided to make an effort to slip into England myself and have a look around. Although, of course, slipping into England was actually the simplest thing in the world for me. I necessarily took every precaution. I traveled as a Dutch merchant, and wore the heavily built clothes which are characteristic of their kind. I even carried a Dutch passport. Passports were utterly useless as methods of identification, for every belligerent country had its little factory which would manufacture any quantity of passports of any other nation, and manufacture them very efficiently too, so that only an expert with plenty of time at his disposal could possibly detect the difference. On my arrival in England, as soon as I had made perfectly certain that I had not been noticed by any one, I ran down into the country to my home, where, needless to say, my parents were surprised and delighted to see me. Then I donned my own uniform and reported to the War Office. There, naturally, my reception was also of the warmest. Not only did I confirm that my Verdun report had arrived, but I was able to give lots of further information, particularly about the work of the German General Staff, and also about the number of effective divisions on the Western Front, including details of those about to be brought over from Russia. In fact, my cross-examination at the War Office almost resembled third degree in its intensity, for half a dozen departmental chiefs wanted to talk to me, and I had the honor of a long conversation with Lord Kitchener himself. He was a very remarkable man. Like Haig, he was not a good talker. He would sit looking at me for a full minute, which seemed very much longer, and then would ask me a question in a sentence which comprised not more than half a dozen monosyllabic words. Yet verbosity is not everything, and when I thought it over afterwards, I found that generally those half-dozen simple words had penetrated right to the root of the question in hand. I asked for some information which I could take back to show that I had done a good job. This was easy to arrange. There were 3 of the new army divisions about to leave for France. It could only be a question of weeks before the Germans actually discovered their presence in the line. There could be no real reason why the information should not be given a little in advance, particularly as I was able to point out, since the forthcoming attack was already no secret, even its location being known to the German command. Therefore, this titbit of information would not actually do the Allied cause the slightest harm, and my apparent spectacular success would certainly help me to consolidate my position more strongly than ever. I had come over entirely on my own initiative, and without connection with the organized Secret Service already in England. Before my return, however, I made a call on one man whose name and address I knew already. He was the man who had endeavored to pass on the reports of my unfortunate agents. It was a strange coincidence that this man should have been arrested the day after my visit to the barber's shop, which gave him a raison d'être. My return to Holland was made without difficulty, and after a day or two at Rotterdam, clearing up my affairs, I rushed back to General Headquarters, nor had I miscalculated when I foresaw that my escapade would receive the fullest connivance if I returned in successful mood. Comparatively meager as my information actually was, it was something absolutely definite. I had seen the 3 divisions in their camps. I had even ascertained the exact date at which they would be sent to France. I had seen the men in training and reported that they were a fairly poor lot, not nearly so good as those which had taken the field at Loos during the previous autumn. This, of course, was deliberate deception on my part, as the 3 divisions were as good as any England ever turned out. But my argument was that if I dismissed the prospective attackers as of poor quality, the German command would naturally allot a smaller number of divisions to meet the attack. This, for that matter, is what actually happened, but unfortunately the cumbrous plans of the British command and the individual determined resistance of even the smallest German unit completely destroyed any hope which I had held in this respect. I seemed fated to deal in comparative contrast. Only a few months before, I had been presented to the King of England and the Kaiser of Germany. Now, only a few days later, after a long interview with Lord Kitchener, I was closeted for an hour with General von Falkenhayn himself. He was not unlike Kitchener in many ways. He was a much better talker, but had the same cold, calculating military brain. I often thought afterwards that if only Kitchener had had Falkenhayn's advantages, what a marvelous commander-in-chief he would have made. But then Kitchener knew absolutely nothing of European affairs. His heart and soul were in his beloved Egypt, and it only needed the threat of a few hundred Turks to distract whole armies to its defense. Had he been trained along the same lines as Falkenhayn, thinking always in terms of European and not colonial wars, and in particular had he and all our other generals, for that matter, become accustomed in his junior days as a commander to the handling of large bodies of troops instead of the miserable brigades and scratch divisions which could be raised for maneuver purposes, then the history of the war might have been written very, very differently. As soon as my report was complete, and I had undergone the inevitable cross-examination from the chiefs of different branches of the staff, Colonel Nicolai naturally suggested that I would want to go on leave. It was a strange position. In the German and every other army, 99.9% of officers and men were always wanting to go on leave, and one of the biggest complaints was that there was not enough leave. Yet here was I, being offered leave every week or so, and refusing it. Yet soon I would have to face the problem, for my excuses of pressure of duty and military ardor would soon begin to wear a bit thin. On my flying visit to England, in fact, I had already taken one precautionary step. I had visited Adolphe. The poor old chap was spending the rest of the war in a prison in the Isle of Wight. He was not, of course, treated as a convict. As a matter of fact, in many ways he was better off than the average prisoner of war. He had quite a little suite of apartments in the governor's wing, and had all kinds of privileges, except one. Although he did not know it, none of the letters that he wrote ever reached his home. I obtained the necessary permission and visited him in his prison. He, of course, could not understand what on earth had happened. Why should he be picked out for solitary confinement of this kind? I couldn't tell him, but suggested that he must have made himself a nuisance in the prison camp. Had he ever thought of trying to escape? Why, yes, he said, of course he had. Every officer had. Then I pointed out he must at some time have spoken of it. He must have been overheard, and somehow or other it must have got to official ears. This, then, must be the reason for his imprisonment. Adolphe scratched his head, and presumed that it must be so in default of any other explanation. What he would have said had I told him that I was actually impersonating him at German headquarters, I don't know. Certain he would have thrown a series of fits. It was an easy matter to get him to talk about his home, for he was already greatly concerned that for the last 3 months he had received no news. Naturally, since all the letters from home came automatically to me. I fancy I was always a shade on top of Adolphe, and I am certain that he did not see through my continuous pumping. I fired queries at him on the grounds that my mother might be able to do something in the way of making inquiries through her relations in Alsace. So I asked all sorts of leading questions, supplementing the large amount of information about him and his home life which I possessed already. Poor old Adolphe! He complained bitterly that the English had stolen all his private papers and his wallet of photographs. He little knew that both reposed in my pocket, that his papers and letters had been of the greatest assistance to me, that those in his own writing had formed the basis of a rapid course of instruction, and that his photographs had provided me with a series of mental pictures which I would never forget. I was glad to follow up the subject, however, for it gave me an opportunity. There were 2 or 3 photographs of regimental groups, and so on, and I thought it might be just as well if I were to know the names of the other men in the groups, in case I should meet them at any time. I recalled my temporary discomfiture when I first met Amur. Their faces I had already committed to memory. Accordingly, I said that I would ask the governor if his photographs and papers could be returned. I withdrew, and very soon returned with the whole lot. The photographs I had naturally had copied previously. Adolphe was delighted. He was like a child with a new toy, going over the photographs again, and I took the opportunity to ask the necessary questions and to get the answers wanted. Although the 3 hours, including a meal, which I spent with Adolphe were extraordinarily useful. Could I now risk going on leave? I had deceived Adolphe's father, it is true, but proverbially a mother's eyes are far keener. However, the problem solved itself for me. About a fortnight after my return, I had a telegram from my father, that is, of course, Adolphe's. This tale is apt to become a little confusing. My mother was seriously ill. He himself was going on special leave at once. If I could arrange it, would I go with him, meeting him at Liege at noon the following day? I did not hesitate for a moment. It was a heaven-sent opportunity. Not even a mother would deny a son who was introduced to her by his father, and the fact that my mother was ill would not sharpen her critical faculties. I may seem to harp continuously on this point, but friends to whom I have described my war experiences always ask a lot of questions around this more than any other. They can understand that I could deceive military acquaintances, but they cannot imagine how it was that I could pretend to be Adolphe to his own family. Yet, as I pointed out, this was far simpler than it actually seems. Many an English mother almost failed to recognize her own son when he returned from the war. So changed was he, his body sometimes stooping with weariness, sometimes far healthier than ever before, sometimes a nervous wreck. Were there not many cases of wives not knowing their own husbands? Now I was nearly an inch taller than Adolphe. Well, was not the army life calculated to add height? Furthermore, I was slightly bigger, so that the mere difference in height was not so remarkable. My hair was the same shade, to all external appearances anyway, and what was most important, my eyes were almost of identical shade of his, for it is the eye which gives the character to the face. My complexion was certainly ruddier than Adolphe's, but here again the war was a sufficient explanation. My greatest advantage lay, of course, in the fact that no one had the slightest cause for suspicion. Yet I felt that fortune had after all done me a good turn in providing the emergency and its consequent opportunity. I met my father at Liege the following day. He was tremendously worried. I remembered that he and my Aunt Gretchen had always been of the Derby and Joan type. The train was slow and was sidetracked on the slightest provocation in favor of any other train going towards the front, and it was in the early hours of the following morning that we reached home. There we found my mother certainly very ill, but not quite in such a desperate condition as the telegram to my father had suggested. She was, however, very weak, and could not open her eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Although, of course, I was tremendously sorry for her. I was very fond of her even before she became my mother. Yet, while I hoped that she would make a good recovery, I blessed her illness in that it so effectively covered up the situation which I had been dreading. With my sister I had no difficulty. I knew her fairly well, and Adolphe had talked a lot about her. The letters I had received from home were tremendously useful. I knew the man she was engaged to marry, and was able to ask all the necessary and expected questions. She, too, was so concerned about her mother that even had her critical faculties turned to me, they would have been completely dissolved for the time. As I sat back in my chair at the dinner that evening, in fact, I gave myself a mental pat on the back. This was almost too easy. I should have known that it is often at such moments that fate chooses to administer a nasty shock. The servant girl, a clean, buxom Baden peasant, was clearing away the dinner things. I had remained behind to smoke a cigar. My father and sister had gone on before me to mother's bedroom. The girl closed the door after them, and I saw that she did it very carefully. This alone ought to have put me on the alert, but whether it was the effect of the good dinner, or of so successfully surviving my anticipated ordeal, I don't know, but my mind was not working with quite so much agility as it ought to have been, and when eventually the girl tiptoed to my side and whispered, smiling all over her face, "Hansi will meet you at the bathing hut at 7 tomorrow morning," I regret to say that I showed strong traces of surprise. Who was Hansi? For I had been very careful to sound Adolphe thoroughly about his amorous adventures, if any. I was now quite convinced that after my conversation with him, the photographs I had seen, and my pre-war visits to his home, that I could be at ease and with assurance with any of his male friends. Of his women, if any, I was not nearly so sure. Yet, were there any? I had decided no. Before the war, Adolphe had been a naturally shy, rather reserved young man. There had been no hint at the time of any of my visits, of any affair, honorable or otherwise. He was neither engaged to be married or likely to be. I had pumped him as hard as I could during my recent visit. It's very tough luck being kept here alone, I had said to him. It's bad enough being without male company, but it's even worse being without women. "Oh, women don't trouble me," Adolphe had replied. "They never did." I had believed him in face of the lack of the slightest piece of evidence against him. Yet I ought to have known that even shy, reserved men may have some little romance hidden up their sleeve, and in any case I ought to have been acute enough not to have shown surprise, even if the servant had come up and whispered to me that the house was on fire. A man living in the situation and circumstances which surrounded me ought to be ready for anything. The moment I raised my eyebrows so involuntarily, I knew that I had made a mistake, for I saw a second's look of wonder cross her face. Immediately I recovered myself. I had not been an actor for nothing. "Ah," I whispered, "that was what I was wondering. So it's 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Good, I shall be there." Immediately her look changed. She was all smiles again, looking at me roguishly out of the corners of her eyes as she moved about the room, smiling the while. In fact, so loving was her regard that had it not been for her own remark, I would immediately have assumed that she had had some love passages with Adolphe herself. However, that was obviously not the case. But who was this Hansi? I pondered over my cigar. What was the best thing to do? Should I ask leading questions of my sister? Yet that might lead to all sorts of complications, and in any case might not take me very far forward, for Hansi is a common enough name, and there must be 100 Hansis in the little town. No, I decided, the best thing to do was to go along to the bathing hut at 7 tomorrow morning and see for myself. At least this time I was forewarned. I knew that I had to meet someone named Hansi, and obviously from the circumstances of the appointment it was with romantic intent. So I said no more, except to mention to my father on going to bed that I proposed to get up early in the morning and go for a swim in the lake. He shuddered at the idea, and so did I, for it was still very cold, and the temperature of the lake could scarcely be thought of, fed as it was by mountain streams, mountains on the tops of which snow still lingered. But of course there was no need for me to bathe, only to go to the hut. I was there early enough the following morning, but Hansi was there before me. I entered the little wooden hut and found her standing there, eager love written all over her face. At least that needed no explanation. As soon as I appeared, she rushed to me and flung her arms around me, half murmuring, half sobbing, how glad she was to see me again, what this terrible war meant to her, and so on, and so on. The loving murmurings of many a million of wives and mothers during that terrible period. So this was Adolphe's secret. Well, he had made a fairly good choice. I must give him credit for that. I took such glimpses of her as I could as she pressed herself closely to me, and I must say that she was a very good-looking girl, slightly on the buxom side, as many of the Black Forest girls are, but exuberant with health, and with a clean and pleasant face. Yet why had Adolphe given me no hint of this? However, for the moment a love scene had to be played. Well, I could do that. Not for nothing had I played Romeo and half a dozen other equally romantic parts. I comforted her. My protestations of affection were ordinary enough, but they satisfied her very well. There is something in the way in which you say such things. Even a non-committal phrase can mean a good deal if it is properly put over. For that matter, that is one of the earliest difficulties of a dramatist, that he writes his dialogue in too strong a fashion, not appreciating how the tremendous art of the actor will help, never guessing how the most ordinary phrase can sound tremendously strong from the lips of a man who understands his job. Certainly Hansi played up to me very well, and I was quite confident that she had not the slightest misgiving. It was of course rather necessary to find out something about her, but this would doubtless come when she had got over the first shock of joy of meeting. Her tongue would naturally begin to prattle. Then I ought to learn things. Alas, it did not work out quite so easily as that. All at once she broke off from her sobbing, pulled me by the arm and cried, "But come, come, look, I have brought him here." She pulled me through the door in the partition which marked off the girls' portion of the hut. There, to my amusement, was the local version of a perambulator, and in it reposed a sturdy infant of, I should guess, although I am inexperienced in such matters, about a year old. Taking me by the arm, Hansi led me proudly to the side of the pram. The infant was asleep. She made to wake it up, but I gently restrained her. "No, no, let him sleep," I whispered. I was very, very grateful that in her phrase she had given me an indication of the sex of the baby. Otherwise, I might have made an unforgivable howler. So after I had gazed wondrously on the infant and had called it all the goo-goo names appropriate to such an occasion, we withdrew again to the adjoining room, and the love scene was continued. The girl was certainly desperately fond of Adolphe, I decided, but he must be a real dark horse, for she was prattling away of the things he had said to her, using phrases which I would never have dreamt that he could have mouthed. But there a man in a love affair will talk in a style which would make him blush on any other occasion. "You remember that night in July," she said, "when you first knew that the war was near, how we sat up there on the mountain by the waterfall, and how you told me how you loved me?" "Of course I remember," I whispered, embracing her fondly. "Do you think I could ever forget?" "Oh, it seemed so strange," she continued, "for you had always been so silent and so reserved. It seemed so strange to hear you talking of love and of passion." Oh, I was surprised. So was I. I had never suspected Adolphe capable of things like that. "I had loved you for a long time," I protested, "but I had been afraid to tell you. You seemed so beautiful, and, as you say, was so shy." "Oh, but why should you be so shy?" she murmured. "You a noble, and I a servant girl. Oh, this war has brought much evil, but at least it brought happiness to me, for surely you would never have told me of your love had it not been for that overwhelming shadow of the war, and surely had it not been for that shadow and the atmosphere that came with it, surely then you would have been too shy to have loved me, and I would never have borne a child for you." "You do not blame me too much, then," I suggested, beginning now to see the course of events fairly clearly. "Blame you?" she cried. "Of course I don't. Why did I not offer myself to you? I was so bold that my shame almost torments me now. Yet I dismiss it, since it gave you to me and our baby to us both. Blame you? Why, it was you who resisted, talking of marriage. Don't you remember? Blame you? Why, it was the happiest moment in my life, just you and I." The position was getting slightly hectic. She was clinging close to me, visualizing again the scene by the waterfall. A very pretty scene, a very natural scene, and one which I suppose was played by 1,000 waterfalls and in hundreds of thousands of other places in similar circumstances. But it was soon evident that she expected a repetition of the play right here and now. I admit to being troubled. Not that my views are necessarily narrow. Here was a very pretty girl, asking for love. It was my duty to give it to her in order to sustain my part. There was no great difficulty there, but I was thinking rather of Adolphe. There are surely limits to the things a spy may do. He may take a man's place, take his father and his mother, but should he fake his lover? I knew how the Victorian dramatist would have settled the problem, but his solution scarcely fitted my present circumstances. This episode troubled my mind bitterly for a long time. I felt that it was the dirtiest trick my profession had played on me, since Adolphe is still alive and fairly well known in his hometown. It may be considered bad taste on my part to publish this incident, although it was, as may well be imagined, one of the most hectic moments of my career. I would like to say at this stage, therefore, that I would never have published it without the fullest permission from Adolphe, and even more important, that of his wife. Suppose again I pause to gather up the threads. It took Adolphe some time after the war to pardon me for my impersonation of him, but he was too good-hearted a fellow to harbor animosity forever. So for many years now we have resumed our old friendship, and visit each other regularly. Now he is happily married, not to Hansi, but to a girl of his own station. For Hansi, alas, is worse than dead. During an air raid on Freiburg by British aeroplanes, she was in a cellar under a house which was shattered by a bomb. The cellar was packed with people, a dozen or more in a confined space. Half of them were killed immediately, the rest buried alive. Picture the scene: 6 dead and 6 living huddled in a dark cellar. Hours passed. Survivors have described the agony of waiting for the rescue, which might never come, before eventually the cellar was dug out from the debris. 48 hours later, 2 more had died, mad, and Hansi had not died, but was insane. Adolphe did all a man could do. He was very fond of the girl, although I believe his amour had been a matter of an emotional moment on the eve of war. The greatest alienist in Europe saw Hansi, but could do nothing for her. So Adolphe placed her in a private home, where she is every attention. That is all that could be done, until man is allowed to be as merciful to his fellow creatures as he is to dogs. Naturally, Adolphe did the proper thing by his son. The boy received an excellent education. Like many other love child, he has a fine brain, and I do not hesitate to prophesy that within the next few years he will prove to be the most brilliant physical chemist Germany has yet produced, which is saying a good deal. Nor does he suffer shame, for he bears Adolphe's name and is treated as his son. Not until 1925 did Adolphe marry. When I heard his news, I hesitated for him, until I met his wife, after dinner in their house, in the same room where the serving girl had whispered her dramatic message. I sat ill at ease, as a man does when he carries another man's secret, but it was Adolphe's wife who made me happy. "You have not asked after Adolphe Jr., Bernard," she remarked. Then, seeing my confusion, she added, "He is growing into a fine boy, very like his father. He comes home on holiday next week." Impulsively I got up and kissed her. It was such a delight to meet a girl with so healthy a mind. Later in the evening I discussed these memoirs, which I had already written. "Of course," I said, "I have left that episode out." "But why?" she asked. "It is the most piquant incident in your story." "I agree, but you need not think of Adolphe. Need he, dear one?" "No, I'm sure I don't mind," Adolphe agreed. "I think of you more than of Adolphe," I said. "For some reason a man can have an affair, and no one thinks the worse of him. The girl has the harder part, but not the hardest. The deceived wife gets most of the sneers." "You are not exactly a deceived wife, since you were not married then." "Nor was I deceived at all," she broke in. "Adolphe told me all about this long before he married me. But Bernard, your story is important. It is history. The history of the war is the story of the war from 1,000 points of view. We must not tamper with history. My old professor taught me that, if nothing else. Besides, how can your story harm me, since I have already acknowledged Adolf's child? I don't like subterfuge. I like the clean truth. That was Annie all over, as she gazed at me with her clear, honest eyes. I hesitated no longer. But mind you, do the same, she teased me roguishly. Mind you, tell the whole story to your wife before you marry her. Then we were rather sad and silent. Thinking of Hansi, I thought of Suzanne too, but was sorrier for Hansi. Suzanne is only dead. Hansi still suffers every night. The agony of that air raid, a pillow clasped to her breast instead of her child.